June 9th, 68 CE. Outside Rome, Emperor Nero drives a dagger into his own throat, ending one of the most tyrannical reigns in Roman history. His final words, according to Suetonius, were, "What an artist perishes in me." Even facing death, Nero remained obsessed with his own image rather than the devastation he had caused. Nero's 14-year reign had transformed from promising beginnings to absolute tyranny, leaving Rome bankrupt, its nobility terrorized, and its people oppressed. But Nero wasn't born a monster. He was created by a system that gave one person unlimited power over millions of lives, with no meaningful checks or balances. When Nero became emperor at just 16 years old in 54 CE, he inherited an imperial system that had already corrupted several predecessors. The Roman Empire had evolved from a republic with divided powers into an autocracy where the emperor's word was law. What made Nero's reign particularly devastating wasn't just his individual cruelty, but how the imperial system enabled and amplified his worst impulses. The story of Nero's tyranny reveals the fundamental flaws in Roman imperial government. Unlike the earlier republic, which had institutions designed to prevent the concentration of power, the empire placed enormous authority in the hands of a single person. When that person lacked moral restraint or sound judgment, the consequences affected millions. Nero's reign demonstrates how quickly unlimited power can corrupt, how political institutions can fail to constrain tyranny, and why the concentration of authority in one person poses inherent dangers to any society. Understanding his rise and fall provides crucial insights into the mechanics of tyranny and the importance of institutional safeguards against the abuse of power. To understand how Nero became one of history's most notorious tyrants, we must examine the Roman imperial system that made his abuses possible. By 54 CE, when Nero assumed power, Rome had abandoned the republican institutions that had once provided checks and balances against concentrated authority. The transformation began with Augustus, Rome's first emperor, who cleverly maintained republican facades while accumulating unprecedented power. Augustus presented himself as first citizen rather than monarch, but he controlled the military, the treasury, and key appointments. This created a dangerous precedent. Emperors wielded absolute authority while maintaining the illusion of constitutional government. The imperial succession system proved particularly problematic. Unlike hereditary monarchies with established rules, Roman succession often depended on adoption, political maneuvering, and military support. This uncertainty created opportunities for ambitious individuals to seize power through manipulation rather than merit or popular consent. Nero's path to power exemplified these systemic weaknesses. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, married Emperor Claudius and convinced him to adopt Nero, displacing Claudius's biological son Britannicus in the succession. When Claudius died in 54 CE, possibly poisoned by Agrippina, the 16-year-old Nero became emperor despite having no administrative experience or demonstrated competence. The Praetorian Guard, originally created to protect emperors, became kingmakers who could elevate or destroy rulers based on their own interests. Their support for Nero's accession demonstrated how military force, rather than institutional legitimacy, determined imperial succession. This gave emperors incentive to prioritize the loyalty of armed forces over the welfare of citizens. The Roman Senate, once the supreme governing body of the Republic, had been reduced to a largely ceremonial institution under the empire. Senators retained prestige and wealth, but possessed little real power to constrain imperial abuse. Nero's treatment of the Senate, executing members on trumped-up charges, confiscating their property, and treating their deliberations with contempt, revealed how completely the imperial system had undermined republican institutions. Economic factors further enabled tyranny. The emperor controlled vast revenues from taxation, conquest, and confiscation, providing resources to fund both legitimate government functions and personal excesses. Nero used imperial wealth to stage elaborate spectacles, construct massive building projects, and reward supporters while devastating the treasury. The lack of independent oversight over imperial finances meant emperors could pursue ruinous policies without immediate consequences. Legal structures also concentrated dangerous authority in imperial hands. The emperor served as supreme judge with power to override existing laws, create new regulations by decree, and determine guilt or innocence in major cases. This eliminated the rule of law as a protection against arbitrary punishment. Under Nero, treason charges became weapons against political rivals, with accusations often based on forced confessions extracted through torture. Once in power, Nero demonstrated how systematically imperial authority could be weaponized against Roman society. His tyranny wasn't random violence, but calculated abuse enabled by the institutional structures that surrounded him. The treason laws became Nero's primary tool for eliminating opposition and seizing wealth. The charge of maiestas, treason, was deliberately vague, allowing prosecutors to interpret almost any action as disloyalty to the emperor. Nero perfected the use of forced confessions and manufactured evidence. The emperor's agents would arrest suspects, subject them to torture until they implicated others, then use those coerced testimonies to justify further arrests. This created expanding webs of persecution, where each victim was compelled to name additional conspirators to end their suffering. The Pisonian conspiracy of 65 CE exemplified this process, beginning with the discovery of a genuine plot, but expanding through forced confessions to encompass dozens of prominent Romans. Confiscation of property provided both financial incentive and practical means for tyranny. When Romans were convicted of treason, their estates reverted to the imperial treasury. This gave Nero strong motivation to target wealthy individuals while providing resources to fund his increasingly expensive projects and spectacles. The imperial court became an instrument for facilitating abuse rather than governance. Nero surrounded himself with advisors and freedmen who enabled his worst impulses rather than providing honest counsel. Figures like Tigellinus, the Praetorian prefect, actively encouraged the emperor's paranoia and violence because their own power depended on maintaining his favor. This created a feedback loop where moderate voices were excluded and extremist advice was rewarded. Terror became a deliberate policy tool rather than merely a byproduct of poor governance. Nero's agents cultivated networks of informers who reported on private conversations, personal relationships, and expressions of dissatisfaction. This surveillance system created an atmosphere where Romans feared to speak freely even in their own homes, effectively eliminating organized opposition before it could develop. Cultural factors reinforce these structural problems. Roman society increasingly embraced emperor worship, treating rulers as divine figures deserving absolute obedience. This religious dimension made resistance to imperial authority not just politically dangerous, but spiritually suspect. The cult of personality surrounding emperors discouraged criticism and enabled increasingly erratic behavior. By the mid-60s CE, Nero's systematic abuse had created a climate of terror that affected all levels of Roman society, demonstrating how imperial institutions could transform a functioning civilization into a police state within a single generation. By 65 CE, Nero's tyranny had pushed Roman society to its breaking point. The emperor who had once promised to restore republican values now ruled through terror, bankrupted the treasury, and alienated virtually every segment of society. His downfall would reveal both the ultimate limits of autocratic power and the devastating cost of systems that concentrate authority without meaningful constraints. The Great Fire of Rome in 64 CE marked a turning point in Nero's reign and public perception. While modern historians generally reject claims that Nero started the fire himself, his response demonstrated the disconnect between imperial priorities and public needs. Instead of focusing solely on relief efforts, Nero used the disaster as an opportunity to seize prime real estate for his massive Golden House Palace complex, covering roughly 100 acres in central Rome. This project epitomized how autocratic systems enable rulers to pursue personal fantasies at public expense. The Golden House featured rotating dining rooms, artificial lakes, and a 120-foot bronze statue of Nero himself. Contemporary sources estimated the palace cost equivalent to several years of imperial revenue, money that could have funded military campaigns, infrastructure projects, or tax relief for struggling citizens. The economic consequences of Nero's rule extended far beyond architectural extravagance. Systematic confiscation of property had disrupted normal commercial relationships and created uncertainty about property rights. Heavy taxation to fund imperial projects strained both urban businesses and rural agriculture. Currency debasement, reducing the silver content of coins to stretch imperial resources, created inflation that affected ordinary Romans' daily lives. Military and provincial administration suffered under Nero's neglect and mismanagement. The emperor's focus on artistic pursuits and court intrigue left little attention for governing the empire's vast territories. Revolts in Britain and Judea revealed how imperial weakness invited challenges from subject populations, while corruption in provincial governance created resentment among local elites who had previously supported Roman rule. The Pisonian conspiracy of 65 CE represented the Roman elite's attempt to restore legitimate governance through assassination. While the plot failed, it demonstrated how completely Nero had alienated the senatorial class and military leadership. The brutal suppression that followed, including forced suicides of prominent figures like the philosopher Seneca and the poet Lucan, eliminated many of Rome's most talented administrators and intellectuals. By 68 CE, multiple factors converged to end Nero's reign. Governors in Gaul, Spain, and Africa declared independence, while the Praetorian Guard withdrew their support. The Senate finally summoned courage to declare Nero a public enemy, authorizing his execution. Faced with certain death, the emperor chose suicide, ending his tyranny but leaving Rome traumatized and weakened. The year of the 4 emperors that followed Nero's death revealed the institutional damage caused by autocratic rule. Without clear succession mechanisms or respected institutions, military commanders competed for imperial power while Rome suffered through civil war. This chaos demonstrated how tyranny doesn't just harm those directly oppressed. It undermines the basic structures that make organized society possible. Nero's legacy serves as a warning about the inevitable consequences of unchecked power. His reign showed how quickly institutional safeguards can erode, how systematic abuse corrupts entire societies, and why the concentration of authority in individual hands poses inherent dangers to human freedom and dignity. The Roman Empire survived Nero's tyranny, but it never fully recovered the stability and prosperity that effective governance requires.